Ryan, James, congratulations. This is the Two Fat Ladies of the Buttery. You've been open for 10 years now.
10 years, yeah, 10 years.
And what prompted you to open up here? Because in some ways it's a slightly odd site. It's a little bit...
It's not some ways, it's just, it's probably the oddest location in Glasgow for a restaurant, to be fair. A lot of it had to do with the fact that back in the 90s when I worked for Old Brewery, and Glasgow didn't have the restaurant scene that it now has, and probably only had maybe about 25 restaurants or something in it. Yeah. Not a huge amount, certainly not the same amount of hotels that we have now either. It wasn't the big tourist destination there is now either. The Buttery and Regano were the two restaurants that really were the big signposts for our company. So it was a restaurant that I was always very aware of. It was one which my dad always aspired to come to. And when I was working for Old Brewery, I was lucky enough to win a number of bonuses, but also prizes within the company. So I had a bit of cash, and so whenever I had cash, this is where we brought him to eat, because we thought he'd arrived. You know, this was splendour as far as he was concerned. I almost bought it twice before. The first time was when... when Spirit... Well, I wasn't, because the other two times I pulled out just even before we even muted the fact that I might want to buy it. But when the Old Brewery sold out to the Spirit Group, they ran it for about a year but realised that it was actually declining at that particular point, so they put it on the market. It sat dormant for about 8 months, and then Ian Fleming, the chap who's now got the Lake Monteith Hotel, he bought it and took it over and ran it for a little bit of time, and then it came on the market again to buy as a property, and at that point didn't have the cash to do it because we'd only just opened up in Two Fat Ladies, and so we didn't buy the property, although Ian wanted to continue on to lease anyway. And then there was a massive fire which took place in Christmas of 2000.
It was in the kitchen, wasn't it? Rather than...
Yeah, it was a massive fire in the kitchen. But thankfully, the owner's insurance for the property meant that his insurance made it airtight and watertight again. But that was all that it did. Okay. So it re-put on the roof and redid the ceilings, but absolutely everything else was gone. So we had a really blank canvas. And so when I was talking to my business partner, who's now sadly departed the show, and sadly missed, but we decided that this might be a good venture. So we both came and looked at it as a shell and went, how are we going to manage this one? Let's just do it anyway, because he remembered it as well from business meetings, etc., etc. It was a place where you came for, when the big deal was happening, this is where you came for to bring the client. Sort of
would this also be the sort of place, back when it was the Buttery, would it be the sort of place where, you know, if you were getting engaged, a wedding anniversary, milestone birthday, this was kind
the celebration restaurant, yeah.
Okay.
Very much the celebration, but expense accounts and celebrations, that's what I remember from the 90s.
Yeah.
But of course,
back in the 90s when people had expense accounts.
It's like, what's a man? But actually, there's, you know, looking back now, in 2007 when we opened it, it was right on the banking collapse. Expense accounts, no more. And that's never recovered, actually, to be honest. I mean, people don't lunch anymore. You know, business people don't lunch. You know, it's changed completely. The whole leaving your desk for 2 hours in the afternoon, or even leaving at 2 o'clock and not going back, doesn't happen anymore. You know, the press would be a major client for this business because the Daily Record was so close. It was based at Anderston Quay, but of course it's not there anymore. There's very few people working in journalism. And so again, so there's that market isn't there either. We've got a massive Scottish Power office just opened up across the road, but they get half an hour for lunch, so they're not going to come to the Buttery for their lunch, you know. So
and you're not going to do an express.
No, that's just the wrong place. Yeah. So again, at lunchtimes we still, even through the week, it's kind of like it's people, I guess, visiting back to reminiscing. So we've got a certain market, and that market is pretty much, you know, kind of like 40s and upwards. And the weekends it kind of changes a little bit, and we get much more of a broader demographic.
It must be quite nice though, having people coming in with their memories of telling about the time they got
exactly. Well, this week, for example, there was a table of 5 on Tuesday night who had not been here since 1967. Now bear in mind, in 1967 it was called the Chandon Buttery. So it was even before Ken McCulloch had invented the Buttery, which was a really posh fine dining restaurant. It was when you had to walk through the Spit and Sawdust bar to get to the back, where there would be wooden benches where people sat for what was in its day fine dining, and was very famous, for venison. And so And what was actually really more interesting was it's how the mind plays tricks. Because one of the chap whose birthday it was, and which is why they were here, I think it was his 80th actually, and he wanted to have a tour of the building, so I gave him a tour of the restaurant while they were sitting having their canopies and drinks in the bar. And he's kind of, oh, not a thing has changed. Not a thing has changed. You're like, oh, really? Really? So all that money spent and not a thing has changed, but that was the whole point of spending all that money, was to do the changes, but also make it look as if nothing had changed.
So and when did it first open? It first opened. It was a bar for
this was
years.
a bar for donkeys. Can you think Anderston was the Gorbals, but on the city side of the river?
Yeah.
So this was an Irish kind of like basically refugee kind of area. Well, second generation, I guess. They fed one side of the docks when the Gorbals fed the other side of the docks.
Okay.
It was when they were building the expressway and the Kingston Bridge that there was a compulsory purchase of this whole area. I mean, there were slums. I mean, there's no romance about what was going on here. I mean, it was pretty much, the toilet was in the middle of the landing in the tenement and was shared by six flats. So, I mean, it wasn't an attractive place to live. Certainly, it was a very buoyant community, and lots of people still talk about the community that whose heart's been ripped out, which is starting to come back with the new development. But it was very much a kind of like just an area for very ordinary working class people.
So it was very much a sort of, not spit and sawdust boozer, but it was a working
it was a spit and sawdust pub. I mean, very much like what the Horseshoe Bar is kind of romantically thought to be now.
Sure.
Very, very, very similar. There was 4 Chandon Belles actually. It was called the Chandon Belles in those days because, again, Irish romanticism. There's a song called the Chandon Bell, and the Chandon Bell rings constantly. And it's ringing.
Closing time?
Well, no, it's mourning the departure of those who left Ireland, calling them home. So it's that whole, this is big yearning. I'm a 4th generation. My grandparents were the refugees from Ireland, and there's still this hankering to be back in Sligo at some point. And like when I see Ben Baldwin, which is the foot of where they lived, I mean, God, they lived in a button ben with a straw roof. Without toilet accommodation, without anything apart from a fire in the middle of the room, but it's still very romantic. And I mean, and my relatives who live there now all have lovely bungalows on the land, but they've retained the cottage still there as a nod to the past. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's our Chandon Belle that kills us back. But when they did clearances, or the clearance, because they're basically Castle, Middle Drum Chapel. That's where the people who were in this area, that's where they went to the new housing that was in that place. Thought they were going to riches beyond belief. Yeah. And to a certain extent they were at that particular point.
And so did this place change use then?
Well, no. What happened was the chap who owned the building of the Buttery and the chap who owned the Anderston Savings Bank at the top of the road, they held out for more compulsory purchase because they thought they weren't getting enough and they thought they could wangle more out of the council. But the council then, when they looked at the plans and they redrew up the plans, the expressway was actually going 500 yards away from where we are, and the Kingston Bridge was at least another 500 yards the other way. So they didn't need it. And so therefore, the only 2 buildings that were left to stand in Anderston were the Chandon Belles and Anderston Savings Bank. So they had to reinvent themselves as to what they would be, or basically,
it was the end.
That was the end. So the chap who owned the Chandon Belles sold it to a couple who just won the pools, called Lamonts. And I don't know what I think it was £110,000, which was a lot of money back in 1962, I think.
Oh yeah.
And his wife went on a cordon bleu course with her share of the money, and came back and decided to open it as a restaurant. And again, being the Chandon Belles and that whole Irish romanticism thing, because this was an area where a lot of Irish people or Irish descendants lived, they all came back, and so basically the Chandon Buttery became the most popular place in Glasgow for 2nd, 3rd generation Irish immigrants to come and spend all of their dough. And very romantically, again, it was kind of the place where all the brown envelope deals were done underneath the tables, and kind of like this was the Glasgow Catholic Mafia had their meetings, basically.
I suppose also by this time people begin to make good. They're no longer.
Yeah, exactly. No, the education had taken place. You're in the situation where things had moved on. You're post-war. Comprehensive education was coming in, or at least junior and senior secondary education was in place. And so,
It's a bit more
became
money.
a lot more money, yeah. And so, they were moving into places like Bearsden, Mulgai, and all that kind of stuff, but coming home always. And this was the place where they all met, basically. But it always retained the bar at the front, always which was split and sawdust, and then coming through to the restaurant at the back.
And then when you took over, presumably it was a balancing act between preserving the sort of the heritage of it, but also making it fit for purpose for 21st century.
Yeah. I mean,
customers you've got.
it was. I mean, I think if you look, if I look back now and knew what I knew then, what I know now, and even if I knew how long the refurbishment plan was going to take, because thankfully there was no planning permission involved or anything like that. I mean, it was just a straightforward, you return the building to what it was, and you can do internal alterations, not a problem. The front is listed, but the internals aren't listed, strangely enough, because they should be, but maybe they will be soon enough. But it became an absolute labour of love and a money pit. I mean, absolute money pit. Because it's easier to bulldoze and rebuild than it is to try and regain the splendour of something from the past. So, like, to actually stop and even rebuild something which looks kind of like this would probably have been a lot cheaper than what we had to do.
To do it from scratch, try and...
But in saying that, that was part of the pleasure, and part of the pleasure for me was going around auctions and salvage yards and, actually, how do you source this kind of cutlery for 120 covers so that it looks as if it's been here forever?
You can't get 120 covers of this. There must be some
Well, like God's... sorry, I can get into a... Not religious mode, I just mean fate, kismet, whatever it is amazing. Because I went to lots of auctions, but one Friday, it was just a general auction at McTears. On a Friday morning, and there was boxes and boxes and boxes, and I was looking at these boxes going, that can't be, and there was a hotel's full silverware.
Oh, fantastic.
There was things there that I didn't want, teapots, coffee pots, etc, but each box was getting sold independently, and so it didn't matter what each box cost to me because it was priceless. Of course, there's dealers in the room who won't spend more than. And so I got every single box that I needed to kit this place out with all of the cutlery that it required, apart from the bone handle stuff, which we've had to buy then independently and separately. But it was like so lucky.
You suddenly stumbled upon. What about things like this? I mean, this is very. I think you were saying earlier, this is sort of arts and crafts. Has this been brought in, or has this been renovated?
A lot of it was refurbed, so some of it was taken out, panels of it, and then panels put back in. But generally, it's pretty much left as it was, without any real disruption, apart from having to strip it all, get rid of the smoke damage, and then re-varnish it. Next, I think it probably is one of the big institutions in Glasgow in terms of restaurant institutions. So it's kind of like, it was quite interesting that it had gone on the wane and had gone really downhill. The fire was only, I suppose, the last stage of what was quite a catastrophic 2 or 3 years for the business. So it was going nowhere, and it was very obvious it was going nowhere. It was all getting quite sad. And I think that year, almost the year where in between the fire happening as real, because it happened in December, we opened it, that following year. Gave it a chance to breathe, and then for people to think, oh, what's happened?
Do you think there was a sense that if it had gone and vanished, then people would have missed it, and that gave them a chance to sort of reflect on that and think, this could go, this could be...
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. And I think, because it was it's very rare that when somebody buys a property that you get that in the press. It's not a very interesting story, but every single one of the big broadsheets in Scotland anyway picked it up as a story, because it was kind of, look, it's going to be saved. Partially because, of course, it was a place which journalists loved, because they were used to getting absolutely well-fed and steamboats in here over the years, and so that it was as much about their romantic association with it as it was about mine, to be honest. So it became a bit of a story.
Without getting too misty-eyed about this, was there a sense that, obviously you've been heavily involved, are heavily involved with the Glasgow Restaurateurs Association. Is there part of the idea that you're almost preserving a unique part of Glasgow's hospitality heritage? It's as I said, we don't want to get too sentimental about this, but
I think it could be, but I think it's a side issue to. Okay. I think it's a side issue to. What I saw is a kind of like, I know there wasn't a lot of people who saw it, and somebody who I actually very respect a lot, who's not in our business but he's in the business of property, It was kind of like, what are you doing? You are seriously off your head. That will never work. And not only will it never work, it doesn't fit your brand. So I don't understand what you're doing. It's like, well, thank you very much, because we've just signed the missives and I've just transferred the cash. If you'd told me 6 weeks ago, I might have been able to factor that in. But thanks very much, Ken, actually. But now in process, so it's going to have to happen. And so, I mean, there was a lot of sleepless nights, don't get me wrong, over the piece. I mean, we'd planned for £150,000 for the refurbishment, and that doubled. We hadn't factored in stamp duty because we thought we were outside of the realms of stamp duty because of the price and the way the price was structured. But the HMRC didn't accept the way that it was structured. Right. And so there was another 72 grand had to be found. It was one thing after another. And you know, so there was a lot of beg, borrowing, stealing, kidneys getting sold, paintings getting sold, just to get the place open. And then, of course, when we did open, the first person to arrive, realistically, was Ron McCulloch. Ron McCulloch here, sorry. Ron McCulloch? McKenna, from the Glasgow Herald, who panned it in the paper the week after we opened, and I was like, oh my God. Like it's £1 million down the drain, basically. Between buying the property and all the sundry costs.
Well, you've recovered.
And actually, do you know, it was the best thing that ever happened, because a really duff review, or a really crap review, is better than a really good review, because everybody talks about it. And it became the talk of the sea. But one thing was for sure, everybody knew it was open. Everybody knew it was two fat ladies that had it. And also that it couldn't be nearly as bad as he's saying it was, because if it was, that can't be the two fat ladies that we know.
What's can you tell us a bit about the food? What's changed over the 10 years? If you were to compare and contrast the very first menu to one now, what would be any difference? Cosmetic difference?
Cosmetically, it's not really changed that much at all. I think in style, it's not really changed that much either. In terms of the product we use, it's not changed that much. I think what has changed in the last 10 years is the big movement towards being much more demonstrative about where you're buying your produce from, about making sure that the provenance is on the menu.
And do customers care about that? Are they coming in and are they saying, is this sustainable, or is this Scottish, or is this...
There's two schools of thought in this, and I've had this argument with Jonathan I've had the argument, I've had a discussion with Jonathan from Oxon Finch, and also with the Gannett and various other people who are kind of in our I suppose our league, if you like, Brian Moll, etc., who almost refuse to put it on, because it's kind of like, you should accept that I buy the best from the best.
Okay, yeah.
And that's just the way that it is, which actually excludes them from quite a few tourist programmes like Taste Our Best, because if you don't display it, then they assume that you're not doing it.
Okay.
But actually, I kind of get their argument. But I also get the fact that, you know what, as a tourist, if I'm in Amsterdam or if I'm in Berlin or wherever I am, I wouldn't know what a Buttery is. I could stumble across it. I might even be directed there by a concierge, but I'm not going to be able to trust what they do. So you would have to tell me. So therefore, if you're playing to your own native audience, you can have that argument. But I think when you're playing to a much more international market, which is what we do generally in terms of conference business and convention business, then you have to be much more demonstrative about.
So you very much got to put on the menu, this is Shetland salmon, or this is Giga.
Definitely.